The story begins in the silent space between defeat and captivity, a moment suspended in uncertainty where the outcome is already decided but its meaning has not yet settled. The man at the center of this moment is not defined by a single uniform or rank, but by the psychological condition of someone who understands that the war has passed him by and left him exposed. He does not imagine rescue, nor does he indulge in denial. Instead, he prepares for what history has taught him to expect: humiliation as a final ritual of loss. In war, defeat is rarely allowed to remain private. It is usually staged, observed, and enforced through gestures meant to clarify who now holds power. He assumes he will be made into such a gesture. This expectation has not come from imagination alone, but from years of witnessing how conquered enemies are treated once their usefulness has ended. He has seen prisoners paraded, stripped of rank, reduced to symbols meant to reassure the victorious and warn the defeated. Even before capture, he has rehearsed this outcome internally, telling himself that endurance will be his last remaining duty. To survive humiliation, he believes, is to complete the final obligation of a failed cause. There is a grim comfort in this certainty. If disgrace is inevitable, then at least it can be anticipated and endured with discipline. The physical environment mirrors this psychological preparation. The air feels heavy, not with immediate violence, but with the slow pressure of inevitability. Every sound seems amplified: footsteps, distant commands, the movement of equipment. These are not the noises of battle, but of aftermath, where the machinery of war transitions into administration. It is here that individuals often disappear into categories: prisoner, captive, enemy, labels that erase nuance and reduce a life to a function of defeat. He expects this erasure and braces for it, believing that the loss of dignity will confirm what the war's outcome already implies. Yet beneath this outward readiness lies something more fragile. The anticipation of humiliation is also an attempt to protect what remains of his identity. By accepting degradation in advance, he seeks to control its impact, to prevent it from reaching deeper than necessary. If he expects nothing, then nothing can truly be taken from him. This is not courage in the romantic sense, but a defensive posture shaped by prolonged exposure to violence and loss. His composure is not confidence, but containment. Memory intrudes constantly. Images of earlier victories, long since rendered irrelevant, flicker and vanish. They do not inspire pride so much as disbelief that they ever carried meaning. The collapse has been gradual enough to feel unreal, yet decisive enough to leave no room for argument. The world has shifted, and he now exists on the wrong side of its new order. Humiliation, in this context, feels almost administrative, a final confirmation that the past no longer has authority. He does not expect cruelty for cruelty's sake. What he anticipates is something colder and more systematic: the stripping away of status, the deliberate lowering of posture, the quiet satisfaction of those who can now afford to be indifferent. He imagines faces that will look at him not with anger, but with detached superiority. This, he believes, will be worse than open hostility. Indifference confirms that he no longer matters except as an example. Time stretches. The waiting itself becomes a form of punishment, allowing fear to mature into resignation. He observes his own reactions with a strange detachment, noting how his body remains steady even as his thoughts circle the same conclusions. This internal discipline has been learned over years of command and survival, but now it serves a different purpose. It is no longer about control over others, but about preserving coherence in the face of personal collapse. The broader significance of the moment is not yet visible to him. He cannot know that this encounter will later be interpreted as symbolic or morally instructive. For now, it exists only as a private reckoning, shaped by assumptions about how victors behave and how losers are meant to accept their place. History, as he understands it, does not allow for gentleness at this stage. Respect is not part of the script he has prepared himself to follow. What makes this anticipation especially heavy is the knowledge that humiliation, once imposed, cannot be undone. It will become part of the record, repeated in accounts, photographs, and retellings. Long after the war's strategic decisions are debated, These moments of degradation often endure as shorthand for total defeat. He understands this and feels the weight of becoming such a shorthand. The fear is not of pain, but of permanence. There is also an unspoken awareness that humiliation serves a purpose beyond personal suffering. It reassures the victorious that the moral universe has been corrected, that the enemy's defeat is not only military but existential. To be humiliated is to be publicly repositioned within history's hierarchy. He expects to be placed firmly at the bottom, not through words, but through gestures that communicate finality without explanation. As he waits, the idea of dignity becomes abstract. He no longer imagines preserving it intact, only minimizing its loss. This calculation, cold and pragmatic, reflects the deeper tragedy of prolonged conflict, that individuals learn to negotiate their own degradation as a survival strategy. The fact that he has prepared so thoroughly for this moment suggests how deeply violence has shaped his understanding of human behavior. The silence before the encounter is therefore not empty, but crowded with assumptions. It is filled with rehearsed outcomes, inherited expectations, and historical precedents that leave little room for surprise. He stands at the edge of what he believes to be his final transformation, from actor in events to object of judgment. Whatever happens next, he assumes, will confirm what the war has already declared. What he does not yet realize is that this certainty itself will soon be challenged. The humiliation he has prepared for will not arrive in the form he expects, and the absence of it will be more destabilizing than its presence ever could have been. But at this moment, none of that is visible. There is only the steady breath of someone bracing for the last predictable cruelty of war, convinced that dignity, once lost, can never be restored, and that respect, if it ever existed, belongs exclusively to the victors. The arrival of the British does not announce itself with the theatrical finality the defeated man has prepared for. There is no deliberate pause designed to heighten his exposure, no crowd arranged to witness a symbolic lowering. Instead, the moment unfolds with an almost procedural rhythm, as if this were merely another task in a long sequence of wartime obligations. This absence of ceremony is the first disruption to his expectations. He notices it immediately, though he does not yet understand its significance. The men who enter the space do so with composure, their movements measured, their expressions controlled. Nothing about them suggests the indulgence of triumph. What unsettles him most is not what happens, but what does not. No voice rises to assert dominance. No gesture seeks to remind him of his new status. He is addressed as an object of responsibility rather than a spectacle of defeat. Orders are issued quietly, efficiently, with an emphasis on clarity rather than authority. This tone, so unlike what he has anticipated, creates a sense of dislocation. He feels as though he has stepped into the wrong version of events, one in which the rules he prepared for no longer apply. The British restraint is not warmth, nor is it sympathy. It is something more impersonal and, in its own way, more powerful. Their conduct suggests that humiliation is unnecessary, even wasteful. They behave as if victory does not require reinforcement through cruelty. This implication is deeply unsettling. For years, war has taught him that power must be demonstrated, reinforced, and made visible through dominance. Yet here, power seems to reside in the refusal to perform it. As minutes pass, the atmosphere begins to change. The tension he has carried does not dissolve, but it loses its direction. Fear without an object becomes confusion. He searches for cues, for signs that the expected turn will still come, perhaps delayed but inevitable. Instead, he encounters only professionalism. Papers are checked. Instructions are followed. He is neither rushed nor deliberately slowed. Everything about the process communicates control without hostility. This composure alters the emotional balance of the encounter. The British officers do not need to assert superiority because it is already established. Their restraint implies confidence so complete that it no longer needs expression. This realization begins to unsettle the internal hierarchy he has constructed in his mind. He has assumed that victory seeks validation through the degradation of the defeated. Here, victory appears self-sufficient. The silence in the room is no longer heavy with threat, but with an unfamiliar neutrality. He becomes acutely aware of his own posture, his own breathing, as if uncertain how he is meant to inhabit this unexpected space. The humiliation he prepared for would have given him a role to play, however painful. In its absence, he is left without a script. This absence is not liberating. It is destabilizing. He begins to sense that the British are not interested in him as an individual symbol. They do not seem to need him to represent anything beyond the fact of surrender. This lack of symbolic interest feels, paradoxically, more profound than overt condemnation. It suggests that the war has moved beyond the need for moral theater. The conflict is over, and its conclusion does not require a final display of dominance to feel real. As this realization takes hold, the air seems to shift. The environment feels colder, not in temperature, but in emotional clarity. There is no hostility to push against, no cruelty to resist. The British restraint leaves no obvious point of friction. He finds himself exposed in a different way, stripped not of dignity, but of expectation. The psychological armor he constructed in anticipation of humiliation now feels excessive, even misplaced. This restraint also reframes time itself. Moments that should have passed quickly stretch into something heavier, more reflective. Without confrontation, the encounter becomes a space for awareness rather than endurance. He becomes conscious of the finality of the situation not through punishment, but through order. The war has ended not with a spectacle, but with administration. This realization carries a quiet weight that presses deeper than any shouted insult could have. The British conduct communicates something unspoken but unmistakable. The war has been decided, and there is no need to revisit its moral arguments in this room. Victory is not being negotiated here, it is being managed. This management-oriented approach denies him the emotional clarity of antagonism. He cannot position himself against cruelty if none is offered. He cannot derive meaning from resistance if there is nothing to resist. As he processes this, a subtle inversion occurs. The British restraint begins to exert pressure of its own. By refusing humiliation, they deny him the psychological closure he expected. He is forced to confront his defeat without the simplifying frame of victimhood. There is no cruelty to absorb blame, no degradation to externalize the loss. The outcome must be faced as it is, unadorned and inescapable. This moment marks the first true moral reversal of the encounter. He had assumed that dignity would be taken from him by force. Instead, it remains intact, and its continued presence becomes a burden. Dignity now demands reckoning. It requires him to acknowledge that his defeat is not being masked by cruelty, but clarified by restraint. This clarity is deeply uncomfortable. The British officers, for their part, seem unaffected by this internal shift. Their focus remains on procedure, on ensuring that everything unfolds correctly and efficiently. Yet their very indifference to humiliation transforms the encounter into something far more consequential. By refusing to degrade him, they assert a form of authority that does not depend on emotional dominance. Their power is quiet, institutional, and absolute. The longer the interaction continues, the more he becomes aware that this restraint is not accidental. It is a choice, shaped by discipline and perhaps by a broader understanding of what victory entails. This realization challenges his assumptions not only about his captors, but about the war itself. If victory can be expressed without cruelty, then the moral landscape he believed governed conflict begins to fracture. The air, once thick with expectation, now feels frozen in a different way. It is the stillness that follows a realization rather than a threat. Everyone present seems aware, on some level, that this encounter is not unfolding as anticipated. Yet no one acknowledges it openly. The restraint must be maintained, not discussed. To name it would be to risk breaking its power. By the end of this phase, the defeated man understands that something irreversible has occurred, though he cannot yet articulate it. He has not been humiliated, but neither has he been comforted. He has been placed in a space where the usual emotional logic of war no longer applies. The British respect has altered the air, stripping the moment of spectacle and replacing it with something colder and more profound. In preparing for humiliation, he had braced himself against the worst he could imagine. What he encounters instead is something far more disorienting: victory that does not need to prove itself. This realization begins to unsettle not only his expectations, but the moral framework through which he has understood power, defeat, and the meaning of the war itself. As the encounter continues, respect begins to exert a pressure of its own, subtle at first but steadily intensifying. It does not announce itself, nor does it seek recognition, yet its presence reshapes the psychological landscape more decisively than any overt act of dominance could have done. The British conduct remains consistent, disciplined, and deliberately unremarkable. There is no escalation, no moment where restraint gives way to indulgence. This consistency forces the defeated man to abandon the hope that the expected humiliation has merely been postponed. What is happening now is not a delay, but a different conclusion altogether. The realization arrives gradually, not as a single thought but as an accumulation of small absences. No insult follows his movements. No correction is made to his posture. No reminder is offered of what he has lost. Each omission adds weight to the growing understanding that dignity is not being negotiated here. It is being preserved, not as a gift, but as a byproduct of professional distance. This preservation is deeply unsettling. He had prepared himself to be stripped down to something smaller, simpler, easier to endure. Instead, he remains fully himself, forced to carry the complete awareness of defeat without the relief of degradation. This is where the internal rupture begins. Respect, when expected, can feel reassuring. When unexpected, it becomes destabilizing. It removes the familiar emotional structure that allows a defeated individual to compartmentalize loss. Without humiliation, there is no external cruelty to focus on, no immediate injustice to absorb the shock of collapse. The defeat stands alone, naked and undeniable. It cannot be blamed on the behavior of the victor. It belongs entirely to history and to the choices that led here. The British restraint reframes the encounter as something closer to a conclusion than a punishment. This reframing alters the defeated man's sense of time. The past, once crowded with justification and belief, begins to recede. The future, once unimaginable, now looms with uncomfortable clarity. He is no longer suspended in the drama of capture. He is standing at the threshold of aftermath. The war, for him, has not ended in a final act of cruelty, but in a quiet administrative transfer of authority. As this understanding settles, the atmosphere changes again. The earlier confusion gives way to a heavier, more reflective stillness. The room seems to contract, not physically, but morally. Every action feels charged with meaning precisely because it lacks emotional emphasis. The British officers are not performing restraint for his benefit. They are inhabiting it as a principle. This distinction matters. It suggests that their behavior is not reactive, but foundational. Respect is not something they are choosing to extend in this moment. It is embedded in how they understand their role as victors. This realization challenges the defeated man's assumptions about power. He has lived within a system where authority is asserted through visibility, symbolism, and emotional dominance. Victory, in that framework, must be felt as much as it is declared. Here, power manifests differently. It is quiet, procedural, and uninterested in affirmation. The British do not need him to acknowledge their superiority. It exists independently of his recognition. This form of power is more difficult to resist because it offers no surface against which to push. The psychological effect is profound. He finds himself searching for anger and failing to locate it. There is no obvious cruelty to provoke outrage, no insult to harden resolve. Instead, there is only the slow, inescapable acknowledgement of loss. Respect denies him the emotional defenses he has relied on throughout the war. It forces him to confront the outcome without distortion. This confrontation is not dramatic. It is quiet, persistent, and deeply uncomfortable. As minutes turn into longer stretches of time, he becomes aware of a strange inversion. The British restraint, intended or not, begins to impose a kind of discipline upon him. He feels compelled to mirror their composure, to maintain his own control in the absence of provocation. Humiliation would have allowed him to collapse inward, to retreat into endurance. Respect demands presence. It requires him to remain fully aware, fully responsible for his reactions. This demand creates a new kind of tension. It is not the tension of fear, but of accountability. Without humiliation, there is no emotional excuse for disengagement. He cannot tell himself that he is being treated unjustly, that cruelty explains the pain of defeat. The encounter offers no such narrative refuge. The loss must be understood as structural, not personal. It is the result of forces larger than this room, larger than any single decision made in these final moments. The British officers, meanwhile, seem increasingly aware of the gravity of their own restraint. Their professionalism carries an implicit recognition of responsibility. Absolute power, once achieved, requires careful management. The absence of humiliation is not merely a courtesy, it is a safeguard against the corrosion that unchecked dominance can produce. By maintaining distance, they protect not only the dignity of the defeated, but their own moral coherence as victors. This shared, unspoken awareness contributes to the sense that the air has frozen. The encounter has moved beyond the emotional volatility of war and entered a colder, more reflective space. No one raises their voice. No one rushes. The stillness feels intentional, as if breaking it would risk diminishing the seriousness of what has occurred. The war's conclusion is being honored not through ceremony, but through restraint. For the defeated man, this stillness magnifies every thought. Without external noise, his internal reckoning grows louder. He begins to revisit assumptions he has carried unquestioned for years. If victory does not require humiliation, then perhaps defeat does not require erasure. This possibility is unsettling precisely because it opens space for moral evaluation. It suggests that responsibility cannot be dismissed as a function of circumstances alone. The war's outcome, stripped of emotional distortion, invites judgment that is difficult to escape. This is the moment when respect becomes transformative. It does not absolve. It does not condemn. It simply refuses to interfere with clarity. By doing so, it alters the emotional logic of the encounter. The defeated man is no longer bracing against an external force. He is confronting an internal collapse of certainty. The beliefs that sustained him through conflict now appear fragile, even arbitrary, when measured against the quiet confidence of his captors. The British restraint also reframes the meaning of surrender. It is not presented as a moral failure to be punished, nor as a humiliation to be endured. It is treated as a procedural necessity, a step toward restoring order. This treatment denies surrender its dramatic weight. It becomes ordinary, even mundane. This ordinariness is perhaps the most unsettling aspect of all. It suggests that the war, which once consumed entire lives and identities, can end without fanfare. As this understanding deepens, the defeated man experiences a profound sense of dislocation. He is no longer sure where to place his emotions. The anger he expected to feel has nowhere to go. The shame he prepared for has not been activated. What remains is a quiet awareness of loss that cannot be externalized. It settles inward, heavy and unresolved. The encounter thus becomes a turning point not through action, but through restraint. Respect alters the moral temperature, cooling what might have erupted into something performative. In this cooler space, clarity emerges. The defeated man is forced to see himself not as a victim of humiliation, but as a participant in a concluded history. This realization does not bring peace. It brings a deeper, more enduring discomfort. By the time this phase ends, the psychological transformation is already underway. The air remains frozen, charged with unspoken understanding. Respect has not softened the impact of defeat. It has sharpened it, stripping away emotional insulation and leaving behind a clearer, more demanding reckoning. In refusing to humiliate, the victors have imposed something far heavier, the burden of intact dignity in the face of irreversible loss. As the encounter lingers, the psychological shift deepens. What was once an experience of uncertainty and dislocation begins to settle into something more profound. The weight of responsibility now lies with the victors, as if the very act of respecting the defeated has altered the dynamics of power. This responsibility is not overtly acknowledged. There is no ceremony to mark the gravity of what is being done, yet it is inescapably present in the way the British officers conduct themselves. Every movement, every word spoken, carries the implication that their restraint is not just a moral choice but an ethical necessity. The weight of victory no longer simply rests on the outcome of the war. It now extends into the realm of moral action, where victory must be managed as carefully as the soldiers' weapons were wielded during battle. What becomes clear in this moment is that the absence of cruelty is not a sign of weakness, but of strength. The British officers carry the knowledge that their behavior in this encounter will shape the way the world remembers this victory. History will not recall this moment as one of great triumph or dramatic submission. Instead, it will remember it as one of careful, deliberate power, exercised with such restraint that it nearly feels imperceptible. This is the type of victory that cannot be marked by the outward, obvious gestures of conquest. It is quiet, demanding, and fraught with an uncomfortable kind of duty. The defeated man, meanwhile, begins to feel the burden of this responsibility weigh upon him as well. He has come to understand that his own role in this encounter is not just that of a subject, but of a silent participant in the moral dance of the victors. He had expected to be subjected to humiliation, to be reduced to a passive object of ridicule or pity. Instead, he has been left with an even more difficult task: to confront the reality of his defeat without the emotional release that cruelty would have provided. Without humiliation, he is forced to acknowledge the depth of his loss with no emotional distraction. The absence of suffering has exposed a deeper kind of vulnerability, one that he had not prepared for and is unsure how to navigate. It is this unexpected exposure that begins to shift his understanding of the encounter. He feels himself gradually sinking into the realization that the finality of his defeat is not something that can be easily dismissed or escaped. His identity, once shaped by the expectations of battle and the roles he played within it, is now stripped of the comforting frameworks he had used to make sense of the world. There is no easy narrative of victimhood, no way to blame others for his loss. His failure is now complete, and it has no clear or comforting form. Meanwhile, the British officers continue their professional detachment. They are not dismissive or cold in a way that would provoke resentment. Rather, their restraint conveys a quiet recognition that the conclusion of this war is not just about military dominance, but about the management of human dignity. It is a strange kind of discipline, one that requires not just the organization of forces, but the organization of respect itself. Their behavior becomes a subtle reminder that power can be exercised not through loud victories, but through the measured, thoughtful exercise of control. As the time stretches on, the defeated man begins to feel the weight of this responsibility too. There is an undeniable clarity in the way the British officers behave. They do not need to prove themselves by dominating him. Their strength lies in the fact that they do not need to assert themselves at all. This absence of any aggressive assertion of power begins to feel like its own kind of pressure. Every moment of silence now carries the weight of moral complexity. There is no release, no escape. What he must confront is the raw, unmediated truth of his situation. This change in perception is subtle but profound. He begins to sense that the encounter is no longer just about him and his position. It is about the relationship between him and those who have defeated him. In the absence of humiliation, he finds himself grappling with a new question: how should one respond to power that does not seek to dominate? This question has no easy answer. It would have been easier to hate the British officers if they had subjected him to cruelty. It would have been easier to rally against them if they had taunted him. Instead, they have presented a different kind of challenge. By treating him with respect, they have forced him to examine the very nature of his defeat, and in doing so, they have imposed a new kind of moral dilemma upon him. The officers do not seem to be acting out of malice or cruelty. Their behavior is not one of condescension, nor is it motivated by any deep-seated desire for revenge. They are simply carrying out their duties, guided by an understanding of what it means to bring an end to this conflict. They are not concerned with making a statement through their treatment of the defeated, but with closing the chapter on the war in a manner that reflects their understanding of order and responsibility. Their respect is a quiet acknowledgement that victory, once achieved, must be managed with care. This realization is an uncomfortable one for the defeated man. It forces him to come to terms not just with his own defeat, but with the idea that victory has its own burdens. For the British officers, the act of maintaining restraint is not just about treating him with dignity. It is about recognizing that their behavior will have consequences beyond this room. How they treat him, how they handle this moment, will shape the legacy of their victory. If they were to engage in cruelty, the war would not simply be remembered for the battles fought or the decisions made. It would be remembered for the way the victors chose to finish the fight. By refraining from such actions, they preserve the dignity of the moment. Their respect, though it seems almost invisible, becomes a quiet assertion of their moral integrity. This moral integrity, however, does not come without a cost. As the time passes, it becomes clear that this restraint requires a constant vigilance, a discipline that must be maintained in every moment. It is a form of power that does not rest on force, but on control, the control to not allow this moment to devolve into something less. It is a power that must be carried quietly, without fanfare. This kind of victory demands a kind of ethical rigor that goes beyond the physical battlefield. It is not enough to simply win the war. The victors must also find a way to navigate the moral complexities of their victory. This task, though it is not acknowledged openly, is present in every decision they make, in every word they speak, and in every gesture they offer. The defeated man, caught in this unexpected space of respect and restraint, begins to understand that the ending of this war for him is not just about surrendering to the military superiority of the British. It is about surrendering to a deeper, more existential truth, that victory does not always require degradation. It does not need to be accompanied by cruelty or humiliation. This realization is both liberating and crushing. It liberates him from the emotional trap of victimhood, but it crushes his ability to control the narrative of his defeat. The narrative he had prepared for, the one that allowed him to focus on the injustices and cruelties of war, is now impossible to sustain. In the absence of this emotional release, he is left to grapple with the starkness of his defeat. Without the external justification of mistreatment, there is nothing left to cling to but the raw fact of his failure. This realization forces him to confront not just the physical reality of his surrender, but the deeper implications of what it means to lose in a way that does not allow for self-righteous anger. He is left with nothing but the fact of what has happened, and he must navigate the discomfort of this realization with no external support. By the end of this phase, the encounter has transformed. What began as an expectation of humiliation has shifted into a quiet, almost unbearable reckoning with loss. The victors have not only shaped the terms of their dominance, but have forced the defeated to confront the deeper, more unsettling realities of what it means to lose. The power of this realization does not rest on its obviousness. It rests in the way it subtly, relentlessly, and quietly invades the space, reshaping everything that came before it and everything that will follow. As the encounter continues, the stillness in the room grows heavier, the tension palpable in its quiet complexity. The earlier shock of the British officer's restraint has begun to settle into a profound realization for the defeated man. What he once thought was the final stage of his defeat, the public spectacle of humiliation, has never materialized. Instead, he has been left in an emotional and moral limbo, one where the anticipated release of suffering has not arrived. What should have been a moment of catharsis has become a process of continuous, disorienting reflection. Every movement, every word spoken by the officers feels more deliberate now, more intentional. They do not need to assert their superiority, their restraint speaks volumes on its own. This quiet exercise of control leaves him in a strange space, devoid of any emotional release, forcing him to confront not just his own defeat, but the deeper implications of it. There is no clear outlet for the anger that would have served as a defense mechanism had he been publicly humiliated. Without cruelty, without the ritual degradation he had prepared for, he cannot retreat into righteous indignation. The absence of insult becomes, in its own way, a form of emotional pressure. The space in which he stands feels increasingly cramped, not physically, but morally. In every passing second, the weight of what he is being asked to process intensifies. His defeat, once wrapped in the certainty of humiliation, is now laid bare in its simplest form. It is an event that stands alone, without the comfort of external validation or emotional justification. The British officers, for their part, do not seem affected by the strange weight of their own conduct. They are carrying out their duties with a focus that suggests they have made peace with their actions long before this moment. There is no sense of triumph in their actions, no desire to bask in the victory they have won. Instead, they proceed with quiet professionalism, aware that this moment will have implications beyond this room. In treating the defeated with respect, they have altered the very nature of the narrative of victory, moving it from one of simple dominance to something more measured, more reflective. This transformation of victory into something that does not rely on excess emotion or cruelty forces the defeated man to reframe his entire understanding of what has transpired. With each passing moment, the absence of the emotional release he had expected, be it in the form of humiliation or the anger it might have provoked, begins to gnaw at him. The space around him feels more oppressive, not because of any overt threat, but because of its moral clarity. He can no longer see this encounter through the lens of a predictable, emotion-driven script. He is left to face the stark reality of defeat with nothing to deflect or divert his attention. The British officers have placed him in a moral space where he must either acknowledge his defeat or resist the quiet but undeniable pressure to confront the truth of what has happened. There is no external distraction, no cruelty to reframe the encounter as something to be endured. There is only the confrontation with a loss that must be faced on its own terms. In this realization, the defeated man begins to experience a deeper shift in his own emotional landscape. He has always believed that victory demanded a visible affirmation, through celebration, through public displays of power. He assumed that to be defeated was to be diminished, that the emotional devastation of defeat could only be truly realized when it was followed by open and public humiliation. However, the reality of his situation now offers something more complex, something that forces him to reassess the very foundations of his identity. He is no longer simply a symbol of loss. He is left standing as a human being, stripped of the labels he once wore, forced to reconcile with the aftermath in a way that is entirely unfamiliar. The absence of humiliation leaves him exposed, but not in the way he had imagined. There is no easy emotional outlet for his defeat. He cannot rely on self-righteous anger, nor can he retreat into the narrative of victimhood that would have offered some form of defense. Instead, he is left to carry his own failure, unmediated by the psychological crutch of cruelty or revenge. The weight of defeat becomes internalized, not as something external that can be blamed on others, but as something intrinsic that cannot be escaped. As this realization takes root, the defeated man begins to see the encounter through a new lens. The British officers, by withholding the humiliation he expected, have not spared him from the consequences of his actions or choices. They have not offered forgiveness, nor have they delivered some form of merciful reprieve. Instead, they have allowed the full impact of his defeat to settle in, unaltered by emotional judgment. This is the cruelty of respect. It does not offer an escape from the consequences of failure. It forces him to confront those consequences, to experience the full depth of his defeat without the comforting distraction of anger or shame. This process of confrontation with defeat, with loss, becomes an internal battle for the defeated man. He had prepared himself for the external, visible markers of defeat, the insults, the gestures of power that would have signified his subjugation. But in their absence, he is left with nothing but the emotional and psychological weight of a war that has ended for him not with a dramatic collapse, but with a quiet, irreversible certainty. This shift is not only disorienting but deeply isolating. Without humiliation, without the external reinforcement of his victimhood, he is forced to reckon with his failure on his own, in a way that feels more personal and less theatrical. The officer's decision to treat him with respect, in its quiet but powerful way, becomes a form of moral rigor that is as demanding as any display of physical force. They have removed the crutch of emotional justification from the defeated man's perspective. His defeat cannot be excused, cannot be mitigated by an external emotional narrative. He is left with the simplest and most painful truth. He has lost, and there is no one to blame but the course of history itself.